Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk About. And I'm delighted to be joined by Claire. Claire, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's fascinating, your background. I'm just going to explain to the listeners, how I found you. So I was on LinkedIn going through my normal sort of messages and seeing what people were commenting on. And somebody who I used to work with, he had commented on your post, and I started to read in it, and your first headline, it said every suicide I attended as a police officer was male. And I was like, okay, this is interesting, let's have a look at this. It talked a little bit more about your role as a police officer. It talked about those standout moments, the first suicide you attended, being 21 and telling a family their loved one had died, talking to a young man standing on the edge, and then sadly being medically retired with PTSD in 2016. And then it says that you kind of, that faded into the background until 2023, when two men you knew died, both under the age of 50. And you are now working really hard to get into young boys and help them around. You're working for the NHS, helping them get mental health support teams, helping them in the schools. There's some projects you're doing. So I'm going to be quiet now and let you explain all of it, because I think that you're really going to be able to help our listeners with those difficult, challenging conversations around suicide. And we know the stats around men and boys is high. So over to you, Claire. Thank you so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Nikki, and thanks for having me on. So, my background, I joined Essex Police at 20, very young, very naive. Definitely had rose-tinted glasses on, and that phrase was used often by my seniors. I completed 18 years service, and during that time, one of my main responsibilities, as it is with all police officers, is to attend and support people that are in mental health crisis. And often that crisis is at a suicide or attempted suicide stage. Like I said, I remember vividly the very first death by suicide that I attended. And that image is imprinted very much within my memory. I was 21 at the time, so like I say, very young. But the process began whereby I thought I was slowly becoming desensitized to these kind of incidents and scenarios, and you look at everybody else around you and everybody else is getting on with it. So we're like, oh, okay, this is quite normal. I, again, of a very similar age, 21, was called to support a gentleman who was concerned about his son had gone missing. He'd located his car, and at the same time over the radio, we had a confirmed report that we had had a male jump in front of a train, literally within yards from where we were with the father, and had to break the news to him, which was absolutely devastating. He couldn't face telling his wife and daughter, so we accompanied him back to his home address and had to break the news to his wife and daughter. Again, that's one of the things that has stayed with me. And I think, like you, Nikki, having, worked the job of a police officer, it's those moments where we know what we're about to tell someone is going to change their life forever. And that the words that we're going to deliver is, it's going to change the trajectory of their life, and it will never be the same again. But you carry on, and I attended multiple deaths by suicides. And like I say, every single one was male, but it wasn't really something I was aware of at the time, if I was honest. I did go to attend quite a lot of females that were in crisis and were at risk of attempting suicide, but the deaths by suicide were all male. As I mentioned on the LinkedIn post, I attended an incident with a young male who was about 24, 25, very similar age to me at the time. And he was standing on a very narrow ledge of the top of a multi-storey car park. And I spent 4 hours trying to talk him down. He was in very much like a trance-like state. I know now as a trainee clinical psychologist that he was in a dissociative state, but at the time, for me, it felt like he was kind of in a trance-like state. He would hold his arms out to his side like this. He was faced backwards and he would count down from 10. At any moment, he could have slipped. It definitely wasn't a cry for help. He really was desperately wanting to end his life and to end the pain. His relationship with his girlfriend had broken down and he just couldn't see an alternative. He couldn't see a way out. And we spoke with him for a really long time. But the hook to kind of almost bring him out of that trance-like state was we started to talk about the Stereophonics, which is a band from the 90s. They're still current now, but for the younger listeners, they were quite cool and trendy back in their day. And we started to talk about Stereophonics and the music and different albums and songs. And it was almost like the lights went back on in his eyes. He was back in the room. And then without notice, he climbed down. And we accompanied him to have a mental health assessment. And he was supported after that. So these incidents came very, very frequently. It was part and parcel of being a police officer. At the age of 27, so 7 years into the job, I was promoted to sergeant. So the frequency reduced slightly. You know, you're a bit more office bound, but still very much frontline, always worked in response. And those cases and those incidents continued. So when I was medically retired in 2016, I was formally diagnosed with PTSD as a result of my traumas and lived experiences as a police officer. And quite a few of those traumas did directly relate to the deaths by suicide that I had attended. So the decision was made for me to be medically retired. It came with a very mixed emotions. There was relief in one respect, but in another, I really didn't know who I was other than a police officer. I joined at 20. I started the application process at 19. I chose not to go to uni. I wanted to join the police instead. And I really didn't know who I was, which is actually quite a common thread, isn't it? Of like when officers come to retire, we don't know who we are anymore and like what our identity is. So on a whim, I signed up to do a degree with the Open University. I hadn't gone at 18. I had a place. I deferred. I was just pretty much done with studying and I wanted to be out in the big wide world. So I was medically retired in 2016 and then I started the degree with the Open University 2 years later. I graduated in 2023. So that took me 5 years to complete. And then I went straight into the NHS as an assistant psychologist, where I worked for 2 years. And I worked in both CAM services, so children and adolescent mental health services. So the first was a mental health support team, which was working with children and young people in mainstream schools. so within the south of Essex, so primary schools, secondary schools and colleges. And I was instantly struck by the disparity between the number of males and females that were being referred into the service. So every month we would kind of go through the data and how the referrals were looking, and we'd have female referrals up here on a nice bar chart, male referrals down here. So that was an instant, oh, okay, that seemed strange. You know, we know that boys and girls experience mental health difficulties at the same rate. What's actually, why are we not getting these referrals come through? Suicide had faded into the background for me until late 2023, when two men that I knew tragically and unexpectedly took their lives and died by suicide. One in particular was the partner of a very, very close friend of mine, and she is happy for me to talk about her experiences, and everything came flooding back, and it kind of hit me in the face, and I was like, whoa, we're right back here again. The difference was I wasn't supporting my close friend in the capacity as a police officer. It wasn't a professional relationship. It was very much a personal relationship, and I could feel and absorb her enduring pain that, you know, the tragic death of her partner had left behind. And these were within weeks of each other. And then a few weeks after that, somebody local in my area also died by suicide in the woods very close to me. So that, along with the recognition of the disparity between boys and girls referrals, it was a bit of a light bulb moment. And I thought to myself, right, we have an opportunity to make some changes here in a mental health capacity and within services. So we know that suicide is the leading cause of death in men under the age of 50. In fact, I think some recent stats, I think it's now under the age of 54, but don't quote me on that. But I think it has raised to 54 actually. So I put a proposal forward to conduct a quality improvement project within my service, which was a mental health support team within an NHS trust, to increase referrals for boys and to bring about health equity and improve mental health outcomes for boys and adolescent boys in particular. So in one particular school within Essex, in the south of Essex, 96% of all referrals were for girls. So just 4% were for boys. So it was agreed that that would be where I would conduct my quality improvement project. And I started that in January 2023. The approach that I took was very much a collaborative co-production methodology. So as an assistant psychologist, I was able to recruit boys who were students between years 8 and 10. And I had around 11 boys that regularly attended. So we met once a month and we spoke about the barriers of accessing mental health support, what would need to change to improve self-help seeking behaviours, and how the boys could be better supported in school with regards to having mental health difficulties. So a couple of things came out of that participation group, and they were stigmas around masculinity, boys being seen as weak, fear of peers finding out that they were accessing support, the process by which they could access support. So there was, for example, in this particular school, there was a wellbeing hub, which was glass. So if you went in there to reach out for support, you were seen by everybody else that was walking through the corridor at that time. We spoke about intergenerational expectations around men and boys. And we spoke a lot about challenging behaviour. So prior to joining the NHS, I worked for almost 6 years in an alternative education provision, working predominantly with adolescent boys. And each and every boy was experiencing enduring mental health difficulties, and all had experienced trauma. Now, they presented these mental health difficulties in a way that was unmanageable for mainstream school. So they presented through their difficulties through challenging behaviour. So that, for me, was really key in kind of unpicking, okay, well, where are we with schools and how schools support boys? So within this particular school, I disseminated an electronic mental health questionnaire, which I devised, which addressed help-seeking behaviours, but also I wanted to look at mental health literacy. So what boys understood to be a mental health difficulty, because there are so many that the boys just aren't aware. For example, difficulty getting to sleep. Boys and quite possibly girls, adolescent girls, won't realise that actually it's a sign of anxiety, isn't it? Difficulty getting to sleep and ruminating and all of those different things. So the mental health questionnaire was designed to highlight the signs and symptoms of mental health difficulty, whilst also obtaining that data to look at the rate at which those difficulties were experienced by boys and girls within this particular school. It also looked, with regards to the help-seeking behaviours, their willingness to seek out and accept mental health support. Also looked at challenging behaviour as well. So the findings from the questionnaire, I found that I was able to conclude within this particular school. Obviously, I can't generalise these findings across wider school populations, but within this particular school, the findings, looking at and evaluating, boys were more likely to present mental health difficulties through challenging behaviour compared to girls. Boys were more likely, believe it or not, to accept mental health support compared with girls, which I was really surprised about. However, they were less likely to seek it out. So if it was offered, if it was highlighted and offered, we can do a referral for you, boys are more likely to accept that help, and for that referral to be made and for them to see a clinician within school for some early intervention support. In relation to accepting help, I also explored whether the gender of the practitioner was a factor. And I made the assumption, my hypothesis was, yes, it was. I worked in a service which was 95%, if not more, female. And certainly all the practitioners within the locality I was working in were female. 74% of boys said they did not mind the gender of the practitioner. So there is some research that says barriers are female practitioners, and that could be a barrier. I didn't find that within this particular school. However, interestingly, gender was a factor for girls, citing a preference for female practitioners. So I kind of looked at all of that, and with the help of the participation group of boys, we co-produced an assembly and a very short 20-minute intervention which was delivered to all boys across years 7 to 13 within this particular school. And we did it over 3 separate assemblies. I was able to collaborate with Health Watch Essex, and I had the wonderful Scott Tatum come on board with my project. I'm very mindful that I'm a middle-class female, and I'm not who they want to see stood on the stage. I'm not relatable in any way, shape or form. However, Scott was, and Scott has lived experience of low mood and anxiety in childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. So I felt that was really important. So we worked collaboratively, the boys and I, and we devised this assembly, a very short intervention. And as a result, at the end, I also did some I did a parent-carer evening forum, whereby all parents and carers were invited, and it was specifically around supporting boys with mental health. And that went really well, actually. We had about 60 attend, which apparently for an evening, and parent participation was deemed a success. So that was great. By the November, I had, with working collaboratively with the school, with the mental health team, the leads within the school, and the boys and the support of Health Watch Essex, collectively, we were able to increase referrals from 4% to 35%. So it was fantastic. So, I mean, I can't do the maths on how many times we'd increased that, but it worked. So I had that in mind. I was like, right, okay, we could have something here, but we need to move forward. I need to move forward, holding the voice of the boys very much in the forefront of everything that I did. I'm also the mother of a boy as well. I mean, he's 20 now, but when I started doing this work, he was still very much an adolescent. So that was that. I'm now completing the doctorate, University of Essex, and as part of our training, we are given the opportunity to complete a piece of research, so a thesis. I went in very, very clear about what I would like to do, and I have been supported to do that. So my thesis is now around using co-production with something that we call PAR, which is participatory action research. So working collaboratively with boys within a school to develop interventions which will improve mental health literacy, so for that to help them understand what the signs and symptoms of mental health difficulty are, and to improve help-seeking behaviours. And that's where we are now. If you haven't fallen asleep by now listening to all that.
Claire, I
I
feel like
like my mouth.
I feel like I want to give you a massive round of applause, to be
Oh,
honest, because that's absolutely incredible. And thank you so much for sharing your journey around your
yeah.
own PTSD and then what you've stepped into in your
Mm,
second career of what you're
yeah.
doing around now boys. And I just have a couple of questions that I just like to go through for
Go for it.
say, and now I work with a lot of schools and leaderships around managing conflict and having difficult conversations. So for any of the
Yeah.
schools that I've worked with, if you're listening to this, we will give you details of how to contact Claire at the end of this. And for any parents listening as well, I know there'll be definitely parents listening because, those adolescent years are very challenging for
Yes.
any parent
Mm,
and also for adolescents because I don't know about you, but when I went through my adolescent stage, I was very confused and very mixed up
mm,
and very angry a lot of the time, and
yeah.
definitely gave my mum a tough time. I'm sure she'd tell you that. Let me just take you back. So for those people that are not in the schooling environment, you mentioned you started with years 8 to 10. Can you just give me an age range, a rough age range of what that actually is?
Yeah, so years 8 to 10 would be from the age of 12 up to 15.
Okay, great.
Yeah, the reason, so year seven, I think there was some reluctance about some of the year sevens engaging in the participation group, which was understandable. And they're your 11 to 12-year-olds. Your
Mm,
year eights are 12 to 13-year-olds. The time of year that I did it, it was kind of around springtime. It just wouldn't have been appropriate for the year 11, 12, and 13 boys because of their GCSEs and their A levels.
yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah.
great. Thank you for that. Because I find that fascinating that at this young age already, they are worrying about masculinity. We know that when you go into teenage world, it's very much about your peers and that you're fitting in with your peers, and that's incredibly important at that stage. So that thing about the glass, the well-being hub straight away with the
Absolutely.
glass is
Yeah.
is fascinating. And that they're already, and you talked about intergenerational around what we are teaching our kids,
Mm.
what they are growing up with, and then we can add on to that the next layer of social media where they're also being told what they should be as a
Absolutely.
yeah.
Which is extremely topical, isn't it?
It
It's
is at the moment.
something
Yeah, it is.
at
Yeah.
the moment with the Louis Theroux documentary Inside the Manosphere. It's, we're just fighting this battle, aren't we? And this wave of this ideology around masculinity, which I believe is toxic. I'm
Mm,
quite happy to call it toxic masculinity. I'm very clear that masculinity should be embraced.
mm,
I don't want to emasculate boys and men, but it's that toxic
mm.
masculinity. And I think it's really important to differentiate between the two because I have had some comments and some feedback saying like around this masculinity, and I've had to kind of explain, no, I'm not talking about masculinity. I'm talking about masculinity that actually has quite a detrimental effect. It's toxic. It creates barriers. It creates stigmas,
Mm.
and that's the masculinity
Yeah.
that we need to address.
Yeah. Thanks for the clarity on that, Claire. Also, the other thing that I found very interesting is that if you say to them, "There's help available," then they're more willing to go, "Great, I'll have that help." So you see, I don't think or let me reframe that. I think when I look at those people that I've spoken to who are suicidal, or those people who have got to the stage where they're making those life and death decisions, that I'm just trying to think of the time when somebody had said to them, actually, there's this help available, and what the difference would have been. And I find that really interesting, that just that one simple sentence of there's some help available.
Yeah.
It's
And that
it's
was
okay.
one of my recommendations that I made and concluded at the end of my project was for a self-referral process that is accessible via a QR code, for example, with posters on the back of every boys' toilet, all the doors, and for girls as well. You know, it is important for girls, and I don't want to discredit the girls, but the disparities with the boys, and that's why I'm focusing on the boys. So a QR code where they could discreetly scan it, open it up, complete a self-referral form, which would then go to the mental health lead within the school, who would then reach out to that boy and then make an assessment and decide whether a referral would be appropriate. One thing that she did note was at the point in which boys came to their attention that they were in need of mental health support, they no longer met the threshold for the mental health support team, which provides preventative and early intervention support. Because by the time they came to the attention of the mental health leads within the school, they had to go directly to CAMS. They were risky. They were already self-harming. They were already experiencing suicidal ideation. And that was a really interesting kind of observation that we made together. That we need to be working as a mental health service. We need to be working with teachers, educators, school staff to teach and present how boys present mental health difficulties differently to girls. They present in a very different way. It can be very aggressive. It can be very angry. The behaviour is very challenging. It could be bullying. There's all these different presentations that actually we need to look beyond the boy that's deemed problematic and unpick those layers and think, okay, well, what's actually going on for this boy? Is that because there'll always be more to that. And I think that's something that's really important. So the overarching theme for my theses is to reduce the emergence of suicidal ideation. And everything that I do comes under that umbrella. Because I think if we can co-create interventions that can be universally rolled out across all schools within the UK, we do stand a chance of changing the trajectory and these statistics for future generations of boys. It's hard. We're to change the stereotype ideologies, the stigmas and barriers with men in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s is difficult. It's easier if we do that whilst they're in early adolescence and continue to build on that. I spoke to my builder. We had a builder in a couple of years ago. It was actually in 2023, funnily enough, that autumn, the same time. He was 23 years old. He went to a local school, and 5 boys he went to school with had all died by suicide since leaving school. So between the ages of 16 and 23, he had lost 5 friends to suicide. And it just takes your breath away. And you're like, okay, this is in my local area. I'm not reading about this in some faraway place. This is happening local.
Yeah. And that is the thing, isn't it? During this conversation, there will be people who have died by suicide.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the reality of it. And I think that is such an important thing. It is here, it's right now. And it feels and sounds like, Claire, that you've got something there with those young boys doing your work, and it's incredible. And thank you so much for coming on to today's podcast and sharing that. And yeah, for anybody who's listening who's in education, I urge you to get in contact with Claire, and so that we can help reduce that statistic. That is a crazy statistic when you look at it, around how many young men are dying from suicide. Claire, where can we find you? Where can people listening to this podcast find you?
You can find me via the University of Essex website. Just put my name in. You can find me on LinkedIn, Claire Dunn, trainee clinical psychologist. Yeah, either of those, drop me a DM. My thesis work is currently in the preliminary stages, the proposal stages. I'm doing the systematic reviews, so I'm looking at what research is already there, and this is a huge gap. We do not have gender-specific interventions in the UK designed for adolescent boys to prevent the emergence of suicidal ideation, and that's what I want to change, and I think we can.
I think you definitely can, Claire, with your enthusiasm and drive and determination to do this. I look forward to following your journey. And
thank you, Nikki.
And once again, thank you so much for being here. Reach out to Claire if she can help you at all. If you've listened to this podcast today and things have caused you to think about different aspects, there are helplines always at the end of the podcast, or you can reach out and we're happy to chat. So thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks, Nikki.
If you have in any way been affected by today's podcast episode, there are numbers at the end of the transcript which you can contact. We'd like to thank you all for listening. And if you'd like to join our Facebook group, there is also a link to that in the notes that go with this podcast. Have a great day.